So I figured that I would start making some longer form stuff because one of the reasons that I haven't posted a ton on YouTube just overall is that I really dislike the idea of having to edit uh, a ton of video. And you might say, well, you could just hire an editor, but then I'm like spending a lot of money on an editor, and I don't know. I kind of want to just do this for enjoyment purposes. If no one watches, maybe if my mom, my brother watch, that would be fun. But I figured that I would just give you all a little bit more of a glimpse into not really just my personality, but just longer form thinking without filtering. Because so much of what we see now online gets filtered through this like editing process that is designed to appeal to the ability to pay attention for 3 to 5 seconds at a time. And I kind of realized that like with a lot of the editing stuff that I had been doing previously to this, I was kind of just encouraging an environment and a viewer that was really just looking for the quick answers. And I kind of just fell into that without thinking very much about it. And I think that's a terrible thing for society. I think that's a terrible thing for people who care about learning. I think that's a terrible thing for really any human to not be able to pay attention to something for longer than 3 to 5 seconds. And that's kind of the realm of social media. And I understand that to some degree, it's kind of like, the devil is in the dose. And which is basically why I'm using this platform now, or at least I'm planning on using this platform now to do longer form stuff. So watch it, don't watch it. I would just rather not be contributing to this like attention, this massive attention deficit that people have. And what really inspired this, by the way, for any of you who are curious, there's this guy who has become wildly popular now. His name is Sam Sulek. And if any of you have heard of him, which it's likely that you have, his videos are just like him talking to a camera, just much like this. And I think that people are drawn to that because they're tired on some level of this like ultra filtered nonsense, this like cutting every 2 to 4 seconds nonsense, this oversaturated market of people who aren't really, if any of you were around like during the earlier fitness YouTube days, it was just like videos like this, people making videos like this. So I would like to contribute to the effort in the way that Sam is to sort of bring that back. I think it would be really cool. I think it would be a great way to foster more community in the fitness space. I think it would be a great way to get people to interact in a more genuine way rather than just feeding people cookie cutter information, which, fair in sort of a fair way, like has its merits and has its applications. But I'll kind of leave that maybe the shorter form stuff to Instagram, kind of just because you have to. So anyway, that's kind of my intro rant thing, just what was on my mind. What I'm going to do now is I'm training pole today. This is my apartment, which if any of you have been watching any of these kinds of videos for any length of time, there's a bathroom over there, my bedroom over there. I live with my girlfriend and my 2 cats, but she's not here right now. They are asleep, so it's just me awake here. And I'm going to go into my apartment gym, and I'm going to go through a pole session. And by pole, I just mean back, because I'm training upper back and lats today. And what I'm going to do is just in a sort of longer form style, go through the session and go through what I'm thinking during the session, and maybe you all can benefit from it and pick up some helpful things insofar as cueing and muscle bias and all that bullshit. So hope you all enjoy, and yeah, we'll see how this goes. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to not having to edit anything. Maybe some of you are listening to this on a walk or during cardio or during a drive or something. Hopefully that's what you're doing, so that you don't end up getting too bored. Anyway, I'll see you all in the gym. So, gonna start out with some pull downs here. Couple things to go over with these. Whenever I'm doing like a bilateral, 2 arm pull down, doing it for upper back purposes. And I'll get into a different variation for lats in a bit. It's not to say that there isn't a ton of overlap, because of course there is, especially with lower lats and any sort of pull down, but I want to make this more of like a high row type motion for upper back, rear delts, whatever. So gonna get a warm up in here. Don't do any kind of bullshit insofar as foam rolling, stretching, any of that other stuff. I think if your exercise selection execution is on point, you don't really need to worry about a warm up that isn't, the exercise that you're doing. And what I find is the less bullshit that you have in your warm up, the more effective your working sets, because you're not just wasting energy. So first thing I have here is put some free moving handles on the fixed bar. The reason I do that is so that my grip isn't restricted, and so that my forearm rotation and motion isn't restricted. I find that a lot of people tend to get some wrist, forearm discomfort with anything pull down, pressing related. So, pull downs, rows, low to high, high to low, middle to middle. Pull downs tend to be more problematic because of how much more you have to bend your elbow, generally speaking. But you don't have to bend your elbows that much if you're doing a little bit more of like a wide upper back thing. So generally speaking, wider, more pull apart type stuff is going to be more upper back stuff. Things that are more narrow, kind of in front of you, going to be more lat stuff, but obviously there's overlap to a high degree. And where you fail should be fairly obvious. So if you're kind of confused as to where you're failing, the bias obviously won't be that specific, but with any kind of motion where especially you're pulling something apart, going to be a lot of rear delt, upper back type stuff. Another thing here is I got these free moving handles looped a little bit too narrow, so I'm going to move them a little bit wider. It's also not to say that like if you do a wider pull down, you're going to get shoulder and elbow and back cancer. But I don't like a super wide pull down, wider than basically, if you see me kind of at this angle, my arms are maybe angled slightly outward, but no wider, right? Because if you move your arms all the way out here and you're at the end of the bar, you're just missing a bunch of stretch that you could be having a little bit more narrow. And even with upper back stuff, like you want your arms pretty much parallel to the handles at the top. So this is a second warm up. And with everything today, probably do 1 or 2 warm ups, then I'll do a ton of sets, total to failure, probably 2 sets each exercise to failure, which may not sound like a lot, but if you're being pretty specific about what you're doing and which movements, then you can be really specific about where fatigue goes, and as a product of that, you don't need as many sets. These are loop straps. I talked about these before on Instagram, not on YouTube. These are literally $2 a pop or less. They're basically a figure 8 thing that I use for a ton of stuff. One of the stuffs that I use them for is serve as a strap. And so what you can do is loop your hand through one, loop around this way. It's going to be harder to do with 2 hands, so I may have to just say fuck it, but I'll try to do a little demo here. Works the same way as just a regular strap. Kind of just loop it over, wrap it around, and you're good to go. And these are $2. Like I said, you get like 5 or 6 of them for, I don't know, less than $10. So loop them around, bada bing, bada boom, you got your grip. And so this will be first set to failure. So notice there too that I kind of just let the range drop. See a lot of people sort of tossing, and as they start to get fatigued, they want to move away from the fatigue. So instead of just trying to move their arms, what they'll do is they'll pump their chest back, or they'll try to just basically spinal extend the weight down. Not a fan of that. Doesn't mean it can't be useful. But a lot of times what ends up happening is people end up getting all kinds of associated fatigues that are unrelated to what they're trying to do. So a big thing, a big focus for me, just making sure that I let the range of motion sort of drop down until I can't get any more of the range. Other thing to note here is your best friend on these, because you don't have a chest support, is this pad. So what I find is this one isn't adjustable, but it fits me pretty well, luckily. But if you have one that's adjustable, you want to make sure that obviously you need to get into it, right? So it needs to be at least somewhat off of your thigh. But when you get in there, make sure that you're locked the hell down, because if you're not locked down, as soon as you start to pull, you're going to get sort of pulled upward, and then on the way down, or as you start to pull the next rep, part of your body weight is going to be assisting you, right? Which we don't want. We want the target tissues to do the work. So when you get in here and you wedge yourself in here, make sure that you're actually actively pushing through the floor. What I like to think about is like doing almost a calf raise as you go through the pull down. And what that'll do is it'll really, really smush your thigh into the pad. And just as a general rule, you want to be as close in there as you can, and as is practical with whatever variation you're doing. So, you know, some variations you maybe want to be a little bit farther away. Some maybe you're comfortable totally just smushing yourself in. Either way, what I would do is do the calf raise up. Make sure that you really feel a ton of pressure before you even start to pull down. A really easy test to do that, and I'll do my second set now. My second of two is, and I'll show you all once I get in here, but once you get in here and you start to actually load your arms and your shoulders, what you're going to feel is a much higher degree of pressure on those thighs. So that's kind of your first major key in terms of like order of operations that you want to make sure you have under control. So, because if you don't have this pressure down and you go to do your first rep, then the entire set is going to be much harder to catch up with. So I got my grip here, right? Shift my feet forward, push up into the pad, there's a ton of pressure, and then as I start to pull, that pressure really locks in. And I'm keeping that pressure the whole time, especially as I initiate. Right, so the range just kind of slowly drops down more and more over time there. So that's upper back pull down. Another big thing with that is just making sure that your back stays arched when you're doing that, because like I mentioned initially, it's more of a high row. And if you think about it, you know, if you want to make something more horizontal, you could either lower the angle of the cable this way, or the cable could be up here and you could just pull your chest up, right? Both of those are totally valid options. So we're going to move on to something that's a little bit more lat dominant, lower lat dominant. Oh, and another thing, which I'll get into now, is for lats, I really prefer single arm training for reasons that will become more obvious as we go through a ton of these different videos more and more. But I find that whenever you're really focusing on training elevation, depression of the shoulder, shoulders just move differently. So especially if you're a bigger person, I find that single arm stuff easier to individualize between sides. And when it's easier to individualize between sides, and you start to basically get a better feel for like where each arm is more comfortable moving, you'll start to realize just how different your shoulders might actually be, which is in and of itself is not a problem. So don't be worried about a little asymmetry between your arms. It would be weird if your arms were not asymmetrical. So this is going to be a pull down, like I mentioned earlier. Just doing a warm up here, first set. Pull down for the lats, specifically lower portions of the lats, but because the lats are a fan-shaped muscle, they all will contribute together to move the shoulder girdle. And this is kind of what I meant about the strap being much easier to use single arm, because you can use the other arm to, really lock you in. And that's a really nice feeling when you get that strap just really nice and locked. So the biggest difference between this motion and the previous one, well, two biggest differences. Number one is with the upper back pull down, right? We were kind of arched and it was like more of a high row type thing, more of like a pull apart type thing. This one, I'm letting myself relative to the cable be more vertical. So I'm not like leaning back. I'm kind of, maybe I'm a little bit shifted back, but I'm letting my arm come up and kind of in front of me. And in addition to that, because I'm trying to train lats, I really want to focus on shoulder girdle motion. So, upper back stuff, rear delts, teres, they're not going to elevate, or they're not going to control elevation, depression of the shoulder. So when we're looking at training the lats, we need to make sure that we're getting a ton of motion of this clavicle and the shoulder blade upward and downward, or forward and backward, as I'll show a little bit later. So what we call those motions is basically translatory motions, motions where the scapula, the humerus, the clavicle are all sort of sliding together. And that's a really, really important thing for lat training. So with lat training in general, keep a narrower arm path. And when we're training lower lats, more vertical lats, the ones that attach to the hip and some of the lower spine, we want to be more sort of narrow and elevation depression-y with the motion. So notice I'm not arching my back and leaning back, because I actually want the load to sort of mimic that elevation and depression type of plane, right? So as I'm working through it, I'm allowing my shoulder to really shrug up toward my ears on the eccentric, which is hugely important. And then I'm just fucking gripping and ripping on the way down. Also notice that I have the same side leg as the working arm planted, and I'm really pushing up and underneath. And the opposite side hand is going to resist rotation there. So I have essentially a brace on my same side leg. So if I'm about to start with my right arm, I got my right leg pushing up, calf raise like we talked about. Opposite hand pushing into this, resist any sort of turning force that I might be experiencing. So this will be my first of 2 working sets. Really control that shrug up. Notice I'm not letting it go toward the top. Just control the shrug. Let the range drop. So I'll get you all a different angle from the side, second set. But I find that, especially as fatigue starts to set in, right, when that range starts to drop, and I kind of mentioned how people want to start to move away from that. What I notice is, other than people starting to change their spinal position and all that stuff, they often also start to lose contact with the external support that they have, the restraint that they have. So as I start to lose that range, I'm actually concentrating more and more on sort of, my anchors for the exercise. So as I fatigue here, I'm focused more on left leg and right hand than I actually am on the pulling arm. So second set here, I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on the top half of the motion. So really focus and tap out that stretch position. And what you'll see much better from this angle is kind of how that shoulder is sliding up and down. And especially kind of how I like to restrain, again, this right leg underneath, pushing up, left hand. Just fucking rip it. And as I rip it, I'm really focused on pushing up with that right leg. So toward the end there too, sometimes I like to get a little bit of like a sliding down. So just a focus on that depression. And what you'll recognize is you have a lot of strength there. So in terms of how much you can actually output. So from the side, maybe see this a little bit better in terms of just how I like to go about these. Sometimes too, what I'll do is I'll kind of just sit there with my elbow extended, my shoulder flexed with the load. With pull downs, specifically when you're in that really high angle flexion, a lot of times people feel like they need to force that supination, the palm toward the face. Don't need to do that. When you come to the top, you kind of rewind the video, see my sets. You can see that toward the top of the range, I'm actually forcing a little bit of pronation. So when the arm is straighter, right, it's gonna naturally be a little bit easier for you to pronate. And then when the elbow gets bent, because the biceps are a powerful supinator, you're gonna wanna maybe turn your palm toward your face just a little bit. So the rhythm is kind of like you pronate and extend the elbow. Those are kind of paired joint actions from the standpoint of the structure of the elbow. And then as you pull, just a little bit of supination, or maybe just to neutral, right? So you stretch to pronation and you pull to neutral or supination. And that's not really gonna matter as much in a horizontal type thing, specifically because you're not gonna be bending your elbow too much. A lot of people just end up right here or something like that. But because you have to move through so much elbow motion in such a short period of time with pull downs, vertical pull downs, it's much more of a help to allow that forearm to rotate. And if any of you have elbow pain, it can be a huge help. So now we're gonna hit like a low to high, wider grip row. And so just to sort of differentiate the lines of pull between upper back stuff that does, you know, horizontal to slightly more vertical stuff, and upper back stuff that does slightly low to high stuff, because those are different. So in the first pull down variation, we had like that high row pull down type thing. But in this variation, we're gonna have a little bit of like a low to high. And so the first variation might be a little bit more rhomboid type stuff, maybe some low trap type stuff. And in this one, see how that's the way it feels. We're gonna have more middle upper trap type stuff, and a little bit more rear delts as compared to Terry's which we might have had before. So with the low to high stuff, I think using fixed implements like this is perfectly fine. And notice that I have obviously a bench support here so that I can row this way without any sort of needing to stabilize the rest of the spine, which is going to be a very key thing for output. So, you know, for horizontal or low to high stuff, I think it's very important to have a chest support. And for more vertical stuff, you can use the thigh pad. But the reason I think that the fixed bar is okay for the low to high stuff is for the same reason that you would want forearm motion in the what's it called? You would want forearm motion in the vertical pull down. You know, so if you're in a situation where your elbow needed to go through a ton of range of motion, then you might find yourself having a little bit of discomfort if there's a mismatch in, you know, the forearm position and how that interacts with your elbow, because it has to bend and extend a lot. But with something that's more of like a low to high, something that's wider grip, what you'll find is you don't need to do that to the same degree. And because you don't need to do that, you don't really need to worry as much about that. At least I don't. So I like to think about this as kind of a row, but also kind of a shrug. Right, and so I feel zero stress here on the arms, forearm complex. Get a little bit of a pause at the top. So another thing with this setup is I got the chest support here, but I also am having a little trouble stabilizing the back of the bench. So what I'll do is, instead of dragging the dumbbell over, I'll just plant my feet on the back side of the bench, and I kind of create a little bit of a counter force there, so I'm really locked in. So these can be a little awkward to get into and out of, and I was originally going to use straps, but I don't need them. You're going to be pretty piss weak with this motion relative to the other motions if you do it well. So again, you don't really need to focus too much on maximizing grip in an instance where, you know, I like to basically train forearms indirectly when I can, and when it's not necessary to for the actual amount of weight that I'm using. You'll also notice that with these rows, a big thing that I'm doing is I'm actually sort of fingertip gripping it. You're going to be super weak if you try to grab an implement with the entirety of your hand. A lot of different reasons. One of them is muscle length in the fingers and the wrist, but another is just distance of that implement to the rest of the hand. Right. So if you fingertip grip, the load is basically directly over top of your wrist, whereas if you do this, sometimes it can move in a direction that makes it just a lot harder to actually stabilize. So we'll get a different angle of this just so you all can see arm path and, you know, things from a different angle. So again, with this, we're just going fingertip grip. The way that I'm going to get into it, I'm going to find my comfortable path, which is, I don't know, slightly outside shoulder width. Pick it up using my body weight. Straddle this thing. Notice the tipping of the bench here, so I'm going to put my feet on the back of it. And then nice and high. So much in the same way that I was really digging into the thigh pad on pull downs, in terms of smushing the thigh up against the pad, really focus on digging my chest down into this guy, especially as I get tired. Because if not 100%, if your sternum isn't on this thing, which mine isn't for convenience, what you're going to try to do instead of pulling is a lot of this stuff, right? Which is spinal extension instead of arm extension. So I'll do 3 of these just because they feel good. Bump the weight up some more. And I'll show you all how you can do a little bit of a mechanical drop here. So you can fatigue basically that range that we were doing before. And then you can just shrug. So what you can do is get to the point where you fatigue that range and then just sort of focus on the scapula movement up and back, really fry out the middle and upper traps, and then, you know, whatever sort of upper arm motion comes with that. So we did a more vertical thing for upper back, a low to high thing for upper back, which we said was, you know, vertical was a little bit more rhomboid teres dominant. This will be a little bit more middle trap, upper trap, rear delt dominant. Obviously there's overlap there. And then the vertical pull down that we did was a little bit, or a lot of it more vertical lat biased. And then secondary tissues would be things like teres, rear delt, in addition to that, just because, again, of that shoulder girdle motion as compared to the other two. So what we'll do is a more horizontal row for lats now. Single arm again. I'll show you all how I like to set that one up. So just going to do a demo set here for the warm up. And we can think about this motion basically in the same exact way that we thought about the vertical single arm pull down, except it's just horizontal. So all the principles are the same. We got a good brace and support with the bench, and I'm pulling nice and narrow with my arm. Notice that it's not like totally horizontal, because those upper lats, especially depending on your structure, will run a little bit low to high up into the arm, right? Because the attachment is somewhere up here and they run all the way down through the thoracic spine. So the angle has to be a little bit like that. And, you know, same principles here with the bench. Using the bench essentially as an anchor point so that I can be stable, much in the same way that the thigh pad and the bench were used in the other example. And can't see it from this angle, but the bench is actually pinned up against the bottom. And what I'm really focused on is jamming the opposite side hip into the bench the whole time. So gonna bump the weight up for first working set here. And I actually don't love that being up that high, so I'm gonna move it down one. And yeah, let's just see what happens here. 2 sets here as well. Jam that thigh up, opposite hand pushing into the bench, and then nice and narrow for a pull. And notice how much I'm reaching forward with the arm. So much like in the other one, letting that shoulder girdle shift So, you know, instead of the pull down variation where we were shifting here, my arm is just in front of me and we're shifting front to back. And a really big thing with this, and I'll use another angle here, is not only to know exactly where your legs need to be and your arms need to be to use this restraint, but also how they need to be pushing into the thing. So the big part of the single arm row stuff, which is distinct from any double arm row, is with the double arm row, I really just needed something to hold me and to prevent me from falling forward. But this is twofold, even though it's lighter, right? Because I'm not using two arms. It's not only pulling me forward, it's also trying to turn me. So if I'm holding it in my left hand and I'm pulling with my left hand, it's trying to turn me to the right. So what I need to do is I not only need to push into the bench with my hand and my leg, but I also need to almost pretend like I'm moving the bench to the right so that I don't get turned there. All right, so as I come down, I'm pushing in with my hand. My leg is actually shoving this way, right? It's not just shoving forward. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I don't get turned, right? Because if I get turned and I'm fatiguing in the motion, then I'm taking stress away from where I want it in my lat, which moves my arm, and I'm shifting it toward where I don't want it in my obliques and my spinal erectors. So especially as I fatigue, I'm really focusing on pushing harder into this bench. So especially as you get tired, like I said in every other exercise here, it's going to become more and more important that you push into the bench, or in the case of the sort of upright row we just did, really keeping myself glued from that perspective. So I'm going to bump the weight up for the second and last set, just so I can focus a little bit more on the length and then the range, kind of like I did with the other single arm pull down. And different angle for you here so you can see the arm path and specifically how narrow it is. Another thing too that I actually encourage people to do with cable rows, to some degree, as long as you're controlled about it, is it's okay to use a little bit of momentum or momentum-based intent, right? Like you can accelerate the load and it's going to be a little bit better from a resistance profile standpoint, meaning cable rows, cable pull downs, cable presses for the most part are all going to be really hard when you get to that full contracted position. But we want to be able to fatigue this range, right? So you're going to fail here first. And what happens when you yank a little bit on it is, again, assuming control and actual precision with your technique. If you do a little bit of yanking proportionately because of the inertial effects of that, the forces in the length and position from here to here will go up. And depending on how fast you move the load, the forces might go down toward the short position. So a little bit of yanking never hurt anyone and may actually be a little bit beneficial in some cases. Again, as long as you're under control, which for the most part is going to be determined by how hard you push into your physical anchors, i.e. the bench that I'm using. Whew. Arm path, nice and tight for the lats. Last exercise for the day here. Gonna just do some reverse flies for a little extra rear delt work. Little extra rear delt work, never killed anyone. And a couple things I figured I would film me setting this up like a buffoon so you all could see. A couple things to note about the reverse fly is a lot of people will take clips and like put them over the top of the ball. Cables are really good in tension, not very good in bending, so don't do that. And also I would advise against grabbing the ball and then twisting the ball like that as well. So I'm gonna use my loop straps, which again, $2 Amazon, go get them. Just gonna loop them over themselves so I have a little thing here to push out against, right? Maybe even put your thumb in there as well. And I'm gonna just start by setting these right around shoulder height. I think that's a good place to start. Again, figure 8, loop it onto the handle. The amount of things that you can use these for is just insane. So I'm gonna grab one side, and these should be pretty light, so it shouldn't be hard to do this. Grab the other. And I'm gonna make sure that I'm standing such that when I get to about here, when the balls almost are touching, cables are about 90 degrees from my arms. We don't want to be too far backward relative to the stack, because if we are, then it's going to be really hard in the short position where you're really piss weak. And then as you fatigue, same thing holds true. Don't cheat, just let the range drop. So shoulder height was pretty good for me. I actually think I'll be slightly better off from a specificity standpoint if I'm just slightly low to high. I find that rear delts on a lot of people, not everyone, feel a little bit more connected in a slight low to high path, but there's nothing wrong with being in the middle. There's nothing wrong with being more directly out to the side. There's nothing wrong with being a little bit higher and going a little bit lower. Find what's comfortable for you. I used to be the guy that was like, you have to do it this way because this way will target this thing. And the more people I work with, the more people I see, the more experience I have. Not just working with coaches, but coaches' clients, my own clients. The more I'm like, just here's the general principle of the thing and figure out what fucking feels good and what feels connected to you. So I'll probably do one more set, just because. Another thing too here, just on that note, is I heard someone the other week say something like, we all have the same anatomy, so everyone should be doing the same thing. It was almost verbatim, that kind of language that was used. And that to me is just a person that hasn't worked with anyone. It's like, yeah, we all have, or most of us have shoulder blades and collarbones and humeruses, but the degree to which those structures can specifically differ, and as a consequence, the degree to which the articulating surfaces of those things can be very, very different from person to person. If you've ever seen people live fluoroscopy, x-ray, post-mortem, dissected bones, shit is crazy how different that can actually be from person to person. So, saying that everyone has the same anatomy to me is like kind of saying that everyone has the same personality. It doesn't make really any measure of sense when you look at it with any degree of scrutiny whatsoever. So I'm going to be a little bit more momentum based with these. Really cap out that lengthened end of the range. So that will be it. That's a run. We did 2 exercises for the lats, 1 more horizontal, 1 more vertical, 2 for the upper back, 1 more horizontal, vertical, 1 more low to high, and then 1 for rear delts. And that's all she wrote. I think that's a pretty complete back day. So I wanted to discuss very briefly just some thoughts about volume, because there might be some questions about like, why only 2 sets? Part of it is just the fact that, you know, if you're doing 5 exercises, total of 10 sets to failure is not nothing, but it's also not what a lot of people traditionally think of as like high volume. In my experience, the more precise the exercise selection, the more precise the exercise execution, right? The more intentional that you are with targeting things specifically, the less volume that you need. And in my own experience, I've progressed a lot over the course of the last year, 2 years, especially. And I have not found that I have needed any more volume than, you know, a couple of sets to failure a day. Now, does that mean that you have to do every set to failure? Does that mean that you have to be as precise with things that I am? No, of course not. But you may as well try it out. Why limit yourself to one kind of methodology or approach? You know, as long as you feel confident with your ability to fatigue on an exercise, as long as you feel confident with your ability to manage fatigue longer term, I don't think it's a problem. But, you know, try it out and see what happens.